In the busy city of Onitsha, where the market buzzed with life from dawn to dusk, Chukwuma and his wife lived in a small apartment. Chukwuma was a kind and hardworking man who loved his wife deeply. Adaobi was a trader who sold clothes in the crowded Onitsha market. She was known for her cheerful smile, but lately her smile had been missing. For weeks, Adaobi had been worried about Madame Ngozi, a woman who bought clothes from her on credit. Madame Ngozi had promised to pay back the money within a month, but 3 months had passed and Adaobi had not seen a single naira. One evening, Adaobi returned home, her face filled with frustration. She placed her basket of unsold clothes on the wooden table and sat down with a sigh. Chukwuma, who was reading an old newspaper, noticed her troubled look. "What's the matter, my dear?" he asked, folding the paper and setting it aside. "It's Madam Ngozi," Adaobi replied, her voice trembling. "She still hasn't paid me the money she owes. I have asked her so many times, but she keeps giving excuses." Chukwuma frowned. "How much does she owe you?" 50,000 naira, Adaobi said, her eyes filling with tears. "That money was meant to buy more goods for my shop. Now I can barely keep the business running." Chukwuma sighed and reached for her hand. "Don't worry, Ada. Sometimes people take longer to pay, but they will eventually. Let's give her more time." Adaobi shook her head. "I've waited long enough. She's been buying new clothes and even hosting parties. Yet, she says she has no money to pay me. It's not fair." The next day, Adaobi decided to confront Madame Ngozi again. She left the house early and headed straight to the market. When she reached Madame Ngozi's shop, she found the woman arranging expensive-looking wrappers on her shelves. "Good morning, Madame Ngozi," Adaobi greeted, trying to keep her voice calm. "Good morning, Adaobi," Ngozi replied, barely looking up. "I came to ask about the money you owe me," Adaobi said firmly. "It's been 3 months now." Ngozi sighed loudly as if Adaobi's words were a burden. "Adaobi, I have told you I don't have the money yet. Times are hard." "Times are hard for me too," Adaobi replied, her frustration growing. "You promised to pay me back and I need that money to buy more goods." Ngozi shrugged. "There's nothing I can do. Come back next month." Adaobi clenched her fists. "No, Ngozi, I can't wait any longer. If you won't pay me, I'll take something from your shop worth the amount you owe me." Ngozi's eyes widened in anger. "What did you just say? You dare to threaten me?" "I'm not threatening you," Adaobi said, her voice steady. "I'm only asking for what is rightfully mine." As their argument heated up, people in the market began to gather, watching and whispering. Adaobi, tired of waiting, called two young boys who often helped traders carry goods in the market. "Help me carry these wrappers," she instructed them, pointing to the most expensive ones on Ngozi's shelf. The boys hesitated, glancing at Ngozi, who was fuming with rage. "Don't you dare touch anything in my shop," Ngozi shouted, but Adaobi was determined. "Take them," she ordered the boys, her voice firm. The boys obeyed, grabbing the wrappers and heading for the exit. Ngozi, realizing what was happening, screamed at the top of her lungs, "Thieves! Thieves!" Her voice echoed through the market, and in seconds, traders and shoppers came running from all directions. The two boys, realizing the danger, dropped the goods and ran as fast as their legs could carry them. Adaobi, left standing with the wrappers in her hands, turned to Ngozi in disbelief. "Why are you calling us thieves? You know you owe me." But Ngozi wasn't listening. She kept shouting, pointing at Adaobi. The crowd surrounded Adaobi, their faces filled with anger. Thieves has been disturbing us in this market, one man shouted. We won't let them go this time, another added. Adaobi tried to explain, but her voice was drowned out by the crowd's shout. Fear gripped her heart as she realized the danger she was in. Meanwhile, someone had already sent a message to Chukwuma, telling him what was happening. Back at home, Chukwuma dropped everything and rushed out, his heart pounding. He had no idea the nightmare that awaited him in the market. The market in Onitsha was a world of its own. Traders called out the prices loudly, buyers haggled over goods, and the air was filled with the scent of roasted corn and fried plantain. But this lively atmosphere quickly shifted when Madame Ngozi's voice rose above the noise, screaming, "Thief! Thief!" Adaobi stood frozen in the middle of the commotion, holding the expensive wrappers she had instructed the boys to carry. She had thought Ngozi's debt to her would justify her actions, but now things were spiraling out of control. The boys who had started carrying the wrappers saw the growing crowd and immediately dropped the goods. We didn't sign up for this, one of them muttered as they disappeared into the maze of the market. Adaobi was left alone, clutching the goods tightly. Please listen to me, she pleaded, her voice trembling. I am not a thief. This woman owes me. I'm only taking what she owes me. But the crowd wasn't listening. Years of dealing with thieves in the market has hardened their hearts. The market union had recently decided that anyone caught stealing would face instant punishment, and Adaobi's explanation fell on deaf ears. She's lying, Madame Ngozi shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Adaobi. She sent these boys to steal from my shop. The crowd grew angrier. We've had enough of this nonsense. Thieves have turned this market into a nightmare, one man shouted, holding a heavy stick. Adaobi tried to step back, but the circle around her was closing in. She dropped the wrappers and raised her hands. I'm not a thief, I swear on my life. Please let me explain. But the crowd wasn't interested in explanations. Some men grabbed her arms, dragging her to the center of the market. Bring tires, someone yelled. We'll teach her a lesson. Adaobi's heart pounded in her chest. Tears streamed down her face as she begged, please don't do this. I have a husband, a family. I didn't steal anything. As the mob prepared to punish her, news reached Chukwuma. One of Adaobi's friends had rushed to his shop, breathless and panicked. Chukwuma, she cried out, come quickly, it's Adaobi. They are accusing her of stealing in the market. Adaobi didn't wait to hear more. He grabbed his sandals and ran as fast as he could, waving through the crowded streets of Onitsha. His mind raced with fear and confusion. Adaobi, a thief? It didn't make sense. By the time Chukwuma reached the market, a large crowd had gathered. He pushed his way through, shouting, excuse me, let me through. That's my wife. When he finally saw Adaobi, his heart broke. She was on the ground, her face swollen and bruised from the beatings. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she tried to shield herself from the angry blows. Chukwuma rushed to her side, throwing himself over her body to protect her. Stop this madness, he shouted. She's not a thief, she's my wife. Let me explain. The crowd hesitated for a moment, surprised by his boldness. But Madame Ngozi, still furious, pointed at him. If she's your wife, then you were part of this. You must have planned this together. Chukwuma stood up and raised his hands. I swear to you, we are not thieves. My wife only came here to get what Madame Ngozi owes her. Ask her yourself. She's lying to all of you. But the mob, already worked up by Ngozi's false alarm, was not ready to listen. "We are tired of thieves in this market," someone shouted. "If you want to protect her, then you will take her place." Chukwuma's eyes filled with tears as he looked at Adaobi, who was too weak to speak. "Please," he begged, "let her go. I will take her place. Do whatever you want with me, but leave her alone." The crowd erupted in anger. "Both of them must pay," someone shouted. "Bring the tires and fill." As Chukwuma held Adaobi close, the mob began preparing for the unthinkable. In the distance, the sound of police sirens was faintly heard, but Chukwuma knew it might already be too late. The market that had once been full of life and energy had become a place of fear and chaos. And in the middle of it all, Chukwuma stood, ready to sacrifice everything for the woman he loved. Chukwuma knelt on the dusty ground, holding his battered wife close to him. Adaobi was barely conscious, her once bright eyes now dull with fear and pain. The angry mob circled around them, shouting and waving sticks, stones, and pieces of iron. "Bring the tires," a man yelled, his voice echoing across the crowded market. "No, please," Chukwuma pleaded, his voice breaking. "She is innocent. She's not a thief." The crowd didn't listen. The years of theft and suffering in the market had hardened their hearts. They were tired of waiting for justice from the authorities. They had decided to handle matters their own way, and Chukwuma's words meant nothing to them. Madam Ngozi stood at a distance, arms folded, watching with cold eyes. She smirked, enjoying the chaos she had caused. "This is what happens to thieves," she muttered to herself. Chukwuma stood up, raising his hands high to address the crowd. His voice was loud, but it carried the pain of a man fighting for his life. "Listen to me," he shouted. "I am Chukwuma. I am Adaobi's husband. We are not thieves. My wife came here to collect the money Madam Ngozi owes her. This woman owes us 50,000 naira." Some people in the crowd hesitated, murmuring amongst themselves, "Could it be true?" But the louder voices of anger drowned out any doubts. "She's lying," Ngozi shouted, stepping forward. "I don't owe her anything. They came to steal from my shop." "Enough talking," another man shouted. "We've wasted too much time already. Thieves don't deserve mercy." As a group of young men dragged old tires closer, Chukwuma's heart sank. He knew the mob wouldn't listen to him. He looked down at Adaobi, who was too weak to speak. Tears filled his eyes. "If they won't believe us, I have to protect her," he thought. With sudden determination, Chukwuma turned to the crowd and shouted, "Leave my wife alone. If you want someone to blame, take me instead. Let her go." The crowd paused, shocked by his words. For a brief moment, there was silence. Even Ngozi looked surprised. "You want to take her place?" a tall, muscular man asked, stepping forward. "Yes," Chukwuma said firmly. "She is innocent. Let her go, and you can do whatever you want with me." Adaobi's eyes fluttered open, and she tried to speak, but her voice was too weak. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she clutched Chukwuma's shirt. "No, don't do this," she whispered. Chukwuma knelt down and held her face gently. "You have to leave, Ada. Our children need you. I love you and I will always love you." Before Adaobi could respond, two men grabbed Chukwuma and pulled him away from her. The crowd erupted in cheers, their anger redirected at him. "He's a thief too," someone shouted. "Let's teach him a lesson," another added. As Chukwuma was dragged to the center of the market, Adaobi tried to crawl after him, but she was too weak. She cried out, "No, please, don't hurt him. He didn't do anything wrong." but her voice was drowned out by the noise of the mob. Tires were placed around Chukwuma's body, and someone poured fuel over him. Chukwuma looked at the crowd, his heart breaking. He knew there was no escape, but he felt no regret. He had done what he could do to protect the woman he loved. As the flames were lit, the sound of sirens grew louder. The police were finally arriving, but it was too late. Chukwuma's screams filled the air as the fire consumed him. The crowd began to scatter as the police entered the market, their guns raised. Adaobi, lying on the ground, watched in horror as her husband's life was taken before her eyes. The love of her life, the father of her children, was gone. The police quickly arrested Madame Ngozi and several men who had been part of the mob. But for Adaobi, justice had come too late. She lay there staring at the sky, her heart shattered into pieces. The market, which had been filled with chaos and shouting moments ago, was now eerily silent. Smoke from the fire that had consumed Chukwuma lingered in the air, a grim reminder of the horrors that had just occurred. People who had been part of the mob began to sneak away, their faces filled with guilt and fear as the police moved in. Adaobi lay on the ground, her body weak and her mind numb. She could barely register the police officers shouting orders or the sound of handcuffs clinking as they arrested Madame Ngozi and some of the men who had participated in the mob violence. One of the officers knelt beside Adaobi, speaking softly. "Madam, are you okay? Can you hear me?" Adaobi blinked slowly, her lips trembling. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Tears streamed down her bruised face as she pointed weakly towards the burned remains of her husband. The officer's face tightened with sorrow. "We need to get her to the hospital," he said, motioning for his colleagues to help. As they lifted Adaobi into a patrol vehicle, she clenched her chest, the weight of her grief threatening to suffocate her. Her mind replayed the moment Chukwuka had sacrificed himself to save her. His voice echoed in her head, "You have to leave, Ada. Our children need you." At the hospital, doctors worked quickly to treat Adaobi's injuries. Physically, she would heal, but the emotional scares were far deeper. She lay in the hospital bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. At the market, the police were interrogating Madame Ngozi and the men they had arrested. One of the officers, a stern-looking man with a no-nonsense attitude, turned to Ngozi. "You lied, didn't you?" he asked sharply. Ngozi avoided his gaze, her confidence from earlier completely gone. "I didn't lie," she muttered weakly. "They came to my shop to steal." "Enough," the officer backed. "We've already spoken to witnesses. People saw the boys drop the goods and run. They heard you shouting 'thief' without listening to the woman's side of the story. Do you know what you have done?" Ngozi's lips trembled, but she said nothing. The officer continued, his voice cold. "You caused the death of an innocent man, and you will face the full force of the law for it. Mark my words." As Ngozi was dragged to the police vehicle, whispers spread throughout the market. Traders who had been part of the mob now spoke in hushed tones, afraid of being identified. One of the market leaders, an elderly man named Chief Okafor, stepped forward. His voice trembled with regret as he addressed the remaining crowd. "We have failed as a community," he said. "We allowed anger and frustration to cloud our judgment. An innocent man is dead because of our actions. His blood is on all our hands." Some people nodded in agreement, their faces filled with shame. A few days later, Adaobi was discharged from the hospital. Her body was healing, but her heart ached with every step she took. She returned to her home, which now felt empty without Chukwuma. Their children, too young to fully understand what has happened, clung to her, asking, "Where is Papa?" Adaobi held them close, tears streaming down her face. "Papa is in heaven," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He loved us so much. He's watching over us now." As days turned into weeks, the story of Chukwuma's sacrifice spread throughout Onitsha. People spoke of his bravery and love for his wife. Some traders who had been part of the mob came to Adaobi's house, kneeling before her and begging for forgiveness. "I'm sorry," one man said, his voice heavy with regret. "I didn't know the truth. I let my anger take over, and now an innocent man is gone." Adaobi looked at them with tired eyes. "Your apologies won't bring him back," she said softly. "But if you truly want to make amends, speak out against what happened. Stop this kind of violence from happening again." The police investigation moved quickly. Madam Ngozi and several members of the mob were charged with murder. The trial became a major event in Onitsha, with people from all over the city following the case closely. During the trial, witnesses testified about how Ngozi had falsely accused Adaobi and incited the mob. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for fairness, listened carefully to every detail. In her final statement, she said, "What happened to Chukwuma was a tragedy that should never have occurred. Mob justice is not justice, it is a crime, and those who participate in it will face the consequences." Ngozi was sentenced to life imprisonment, along with several others who had been part of the mob. The ruling sent a strong message to the community, reminding everyone that taking the law into their own hands would not be tolerated. Months later, Adaobi began to find her strength again. She decided to honor Chukwuma's memory by speaking out against mob justice. She visited markets, schools and churches, sharing her story and urging people to think before acting out of anger. "Chukwuma gave his life to protect me," she would say. "His death must not be in vain. We must learn to listen, to seek the truth and to value every human life." Her words touched many, and slowly the culture of mob justice in Onitsha began to change. Though Adaobi's heart remained heavy with the loss of her husband, she found comfort in the legacy he left behind, a legacy of love, sacrifice, and the fight for justice.